We are in session, and today the topic is it seems like a topic that eludes many people, which is power supplies, and I think there's a lot of confusion over milliamps and voltage, paralleling versus serial connections. If you're making, say, 18 volts or 24 volts out of two outputs, the types of, styles of power supply, extension supplies, who actually makes the best supply, what is an RCA connector?
There's a lot of questions.
Why does this power supply have a connector that looks like what's on the back of my old TV? These are all questions that have baffled man since the beginning of time. And today, fortunately, between the three of us, I'm confident that there will be some tangible answers that you can take home and purchase the power supply of your dreams. It's going to do everything that you want it to do. So with that said, and with the gauntlet being thrown down, I feel like it's time to get into. All right. So with that interruption, we're now back to power supplies. So maybe we can start first. Let's start at the beginning of time. Late 90s. And really before that time, there were no power supplies to speak of until Voodoo Lab came on the scene and offered the very first isolated power supply, the Voodoo Lab pedal power. Any of you guys remember that one?
I do.
It's impossible to miss.
I've had so many of them.
Yeah, I mean the original ones didn't have the fancy, outputs 5 and 6 with the high current. I don't even think it had the unregulated settings on it, as I recall.
Yeah.
But very quickly, that as the DL4, which is lately made a resurgence, had come out, and a lot of those other 4 series line 6 effects, the MM4. Yeah, DL4. Then I forget what the distortion one was called.
Yeah, the yellow one.
Yeah. Didn't get the respect it deserved. But in any case, they had to address that issue. Also, Dunlop had the DC brick, which was not isolated. That used all 1/8" jacks. I don't know if you guys remember that. John Mayer actually used one in early incarnations of his board before he cared about noise. Those were really noisy.
Before he cared about noise.
There was the Furman supplies that came on the Furman pedal boards, where I don't know if you guys have ever seen these, and I might just bring one up just for nostalgia purposes. But what it essentially was like a flat pedal board that was carpeted.
Yeah.
And then at the very top of it had sort of like a patch bay and a power supply with 1/8" jacks on it, but it was facing up, like toward the ceiling. So all of your, I don't know that I've ever had somebody request a patch bay that faces up, but it could be a cool look, and I'm hoping that Brian, if he is going to bring it back,
it's perfect to catch all your beer when you spill the beer in a gig. It just goes straight in.
Exactly.
The north facing patch bay. So Brian, I want you to come out with one called True North. And everything points up. But I want to see if I can. Find an old one. To just, if you guys, I mean, I'm sure you guys have seen it. But if anybody's watching this maybe and hasn't seen this, this is gonna be something that may be offensive. It looks so outdated. Here you go. Check this out. We're heading over to Reverb. Now here it is, the Furman.
Oh yeah.
So you can see here, if I zoom in, you have your 9-volt outputs, and these are, I don't think any of these are isolated. They're just all tied together, just one big daisy chain. You got a power strip, and then you got your patch bay up here in the top, where you got all your ins and outs. They even gave you a stereo output. I don't think any of it's isolated. There's even an effects loop in here.
Ooh.
So they were on the right track, but they weren't quite there. And certainly things got better from there, and that's always a good story.
Yeah. Yeah, I had the SKB version of that.
Oh yeah, the SKB version of that.
Yeah, they had a version of it, the SKB version. But yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, and people just didn't know better, you know. They just didn't know better. It was like smoking. They didn't know. It's like smoking and solder and solderless cables. They didn't know, you know. We're gonna forgive them.
Yep.
But they were on the right track. I think that's the thing. Like you look at you look at the Furman specs, the basic specs on paper, comes with a power supply, AC outlets, patch bay included. It's like, oh, this is actually like there's some great options there. They just missed some key points around isolation, and maybe next time an east or west facing patch bay instead of a north facing one.
Right. Yeah, they need to go longitudinal on that. That's for
exactly.
Sure. And you know, yeah, again, it's that was probably rubber stamped from the top. They're like power supply, patch bay, stereo outs. You know, everybody's gonna love it. And you know, so Mr. Furman, you know, put that one out, and we've progressed quite a bit since then.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, I think that was when everything was combined into one. And one of the things that I think precipitated potentially the invention of the pedal power was, you know, rig builders like Dave Friedman, who was good pals with Josh Fiden, who is the guy that founded Voodoo Labs, and or Voodoo Lab. I guess there's no S. And I think Josh used to be based in L.A. With Voodoo Lab, and they were called they weren't called Voodoo Lab in the beginning. It was called like Digital Music Corp or something like that. And they made versions of the rack switchers that became the GCX and the floor controller. So I think this was a response, because in the old days, I talked to like guys like Paul Revere about this, and he was just like, "Yeah, we had to make our own power supplies, you know, from scratch."
That's crazy.
Can you imagine that being a component of what you needed to do to make a pedal board? Is you had to like go source like a toroid transformer, and you had to you know, create all these isolated outputs, or some isolated and some not.
Mm-hmm.
What a catastrophe.
Even legally for liability issues, if something went wrong on tour.
Oh my gosh.
Like can't imagine, man. Can't imagine.
Oh my gosh.
My tech Sonny was rooting around in my power supply.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I'm glad we've come a long way. I'm glad it's progressed. And, you know, obviously the requirements have only gotten bigger as we have progressed as well, which I know we'll chat about. But, man, I can't imagine having to tackle a power supply on top of everything else that needs to be done in building a rig.
Yeah, it would be a pretty daunting task to have to take that on. I feel like even, you know, when I was building pedal boards in volume, just doing custom interfaces was enough. Imagine having to, you know, power supply du jour, and having to do it, you know, with what a pedal power 2 maybe at the time was $120 or $130, something like that. You know, it's not like it's you know, the parts maybe are not so much, but the time is a lot. So God bless Voodoo Lab for making that. And they progressed to the pedal power 2, which took more power, or was able to put out more power. It had the courtesy outlet, so you could run, you know, your AC corded pedals through the back. I thought that was a really smart idea. And you know, power supplies got bigger, and then eventually we started to see what's called a switch mode power supply, as opposed to what Voodoo Lab was up until that time, which was a linear power supply, which required a toroidal transformer, or, you know, technically it's kind of more of a C core, I think, or an R core. But nevertheless, we'll call them semi-toroid transformers up until then. And then you started to see guys like I think True Tone might have been the first to do a switch mode power supply that was an isolated one, is my understanding. I could be wrong. Do you guys have a remembrance of an earlier one?
No, I don't know.
Yeah,
I think True Tone was first. I think that Strymon was second. And then there may have been some other people I'm overlooking here. Chalks maybe was third. And that's not to say that you know, that technology had been around in studios for decades,
or
know,
wall
or at least
warts.
a decade. Yeah, and in wall warts, in a lot of studio gear did use switch mode power supplies, but it hadn't really made its way to pedals yet. But I think we needed to go there because everything was taking 500 milliamps, and most of those power supplies maybe had one or two outputs that could handle it.
Yeah.
So, the necessity for switch mode became critical. And maybe for the viewers, I don't know if one of you guys want to take this on as far as sort of talking about the differences between switch mode and linear and maybe why one is better than the other. Anybody want to take that one?
I have my very, very, I have to admit, uneducated opinion just from experience. So I'll give that and you guys can correct me. So how about we do that?
Let's talk about it. So
one of my favorite things about a linear or toroidal transformer power supply is you can look at some of the outlets. Let's say you have the Pedal Power 2 Plus, and you have a couple of 100 milliamp outlets, a couple of 200. You power one overdrive on there, on one of the 100 milliamp outputs, takes 20 milliamps maybe to power that overdrive. You can exceed some of the other milliamp ratings and look at it more as what can the power supply do as a whole. And you can, maybe out of one of the 200 milliamp outlets, you will be able to power something like a Strymon timeline, just as long as you don't exceed the overall power supply limit of, let's say, 1500 milliamps on something like that. Again, I could be skewing my experience a little bit, but I know that you can pull more from a transformer-based or toroidal transformer-based power supply than something like a switch mode or something that's a bit more digital. You have to stick with the rules a lot more on digital and what is capable on that power supply. Am I way off there, or do you guys have similar experience and kind of, I guess, are you kind of pulling from the same vibe there or experience?
Yeah, I'm gonna be honest. I'm on the same page with you, where I'm very like a lot of these these specs of that kind of stuff is so new to me that I'm learning. I'm needing to learn more and more about. That's actually been my goal this whole year, is to kind of really get into those kind of things to learn. Because I know very, very basic and just the common power supplies that work well. But like all those deep specs that you guys know, that's something I'm still learning.
Yeah. As far as the toroidal power supply, you do certainly have like a milliamp source that you're drawing against. And so there's some manipulation that can happen, but there is also a limitation to kind of going that route per output, depending on how the design is. That's why you could only, let's say, power certain effects off of 5 and 6 on a Pedal Power 2, and you couldn't just use output 1, even if it didn't exceed the total milliamps available.
Yeah.
The True Tone power supply, even though switch mode, can do what you're saying, however, and it is switch mode. I guess technically it's a hybrid, because the AC side of a True Tone, let's say CS12, does have a transformer, and that's why there's a selection toggle or slider on the back of the supply that's only controlling the AC side of the power supply. But the way that they've designed their switch mode power supplies, you basically sort of have an allotment of current. I think it's like 3 amps or 2.5 amps. That's the same as 2,500 milliamps or 3,000 milliamps. And then they give you sort of suggested outputs based on the breakdown of the total amount of current. But you don't actually have to follow that so long as you don't exceed the total amount of current. This is separate from voltage, so you still have to observe the voltage requirements. So if it says 18 volts.
Good to clarify.
You need to have 18 volts. But if it says 18 volts at 100 milliamp, that's not so critical so long as the total number of pedals that you are having powered at their appropriate voltage does not exceed the 2,500 milliamps or the 3,000 milliamps total available in the supply. I know that that's the way that the True Tone one is designed, but some of the other ones, you do need to maintain the milliamp numbers and make sure that those are meeting the specification. Now, there is usually a tendency to underrate some of the supplies slightly, and that's more for the manufacturers kind of leave a little bit left there just in case there's some sort of suboptimal application. So often they may be able to put out slightly more than what they say, but they rate them a little more conservatively so that they're able to ensure that no matter what's thrown at it, or if a manufacturer of a pedal is sort of underestimating their current draw based on, I don't know, some irregular scenario, this is something that they're able to do. But the principal things I'd say are the differentiators between switch mode, at least in the context of pedals, and linear power supplies. This linear is kind of the old style power supply. That's what the Voodoo Lab was, even though the old Furman one wasn't at all isolated. It was using some sort of transformer in order to regulate and have these regulated 9-volt outputs. This is something that can be problematic for a few reasons. One, if they're not shielded properly, they can emit a magnetic field, which can create some noise issues in your signal path. And this is especially true of pedal boards where the power supply is underneath the pedals, and then you're putting pedals on top of it.
Yeah.
And, that style of pedal board came into fashion kind of after the Furman style. Where you have a sort of an angled pedal board, and then you're putting supply underneath, and then pedals go on top. And it was less of a problem, however, with the earlier power supplies like the Pedal Power 1, Pedal Power 2, Pedal Power 2 Plus, because those all had steel chassis, and steel provides some amount of electromagnetic shielding, against a magnetic field. But as the power supplies became more robust and provided more current and more voltage options, they needed to use the case or the chassis of the pedal power or fill in the blank power supply as the heat sink. So they would make it aluminum. But when you switch to aluminum doesn't have any electromagnetic shielding. It only has electrostatic shielding, which is kind of not valuable for what we're using in a power supply. So now, formerly pedals that maybe had no interaction at all, or very minimal interaction with a Pedal Power 2, you replace this with a 4x4 or a Mondo that was made out of aluminum, and now you had a problem because you weren't receiving any of the shielding that was associated with the steel chassis and what that imparted. And so, Voodoo Lab was reticent to admit this. In the style of pedal boards that we made and you guys make primarily, it probably wouldn't have been as much of an issue because usually the power supply is sort of away from everything. But if you were to use sort of like the riser systems and stuff like that, which didn't really exist back then when those were out, we would have noticed more of an issue.
Yeah.
And so when switch mode came out, switch mode style power supplies like Strymon and True Tone and the newest versions of the Chalks like the Chalk 7, 8, 4, this all disappeared because switch mode does not utilize a toroidal transformer like that, and there isn't any noise associated with it that would be related to the transformer. The other thing that we should note about the transformers as well in the toroidal style supplies is that the more current you draw against the total, the more the magnetic field is amplified. So if you have a 2500 milliamp max and you're at 2500 milliamps of current draw, your magnetic field is much larger than if you're only drawing, let's say, 1000 milliamps. And without that shielding, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
And I remember there being instances where we would build boards and I would have our metal manufacturer at the time, it wasn't Robert F. Chapman, that would make these mu metal kind of, it almost looked like a molding. It was made out of sheet metal, but it was like a cast that would go over the power supply to help reduce that noise if we had to put stuff really close to it. And the way that you could tell if your power supply has noise, an easy primitive test, is to take a single coil pickup maybe that you have laying around and wire it to a guitar cable and put it into an amplifier. And you can put the single coil pickup over the power supply if it's a toroidal based linear power supply, and you can see how intense and how large the magnetic field is. And I used to do that to kind of help me determine where I need to keep pedals away from, because some of the power supplies will cap the transformer with like a steel or mu metal block or like a piece of metal, and that will help direct the field to maybe some place where they think it's going to be less problematic. And so sometimes you won't have any issues north-south, but east-west you'll have more of a field because they capped it on the top and it spread the field into a different direction. And so I used to use that single coil pickup trick to sort of help me identify it. It was like a poor man's way to identify this issue. But anyway, I think that we probably can mostly agree that for most people, a switch mode power supply is preferable because there just aren't any of the consequences as far as location, proximity to pedals. Also with a toroidal transformer, you have to get it away from a wah pedal. Can't be anywhere near an inductor. That can be a problem. So switch mode power supplies just don't have this issue, but there are other issues that we can talk about. But I want to let somebody else talk.
I did have one guy this week actually I was chatting to, and he had a pedal train with a Mondo mounted underneath, and he was getting noise issues. And so I actually didn't know the single coil pickup trick, but what I told him to do, because he had some DC cables that were a bit longer, pull your power supply off the bottom of the pedal train, and just while everything's powered up, plugged into an amp, just move your power supply away from the pedals and tell me if your noise reduces, or if it stays exactly the same. Then the noise issues are not coming from your power supply, they're coming from somewhere else. And sure enough, as he moved the power supply away, the magnetic field obviously was less, and his noise kind of went away. So then we were able to point back to the power supply. I've had similar issues in the past with older, I say Seox, you said Chiox, so I'm probably saying it wrong. Brian, tiebreaker?
No, I usually say Seox. So
okay, either we're both wrong and living in ignorance. My customers go back and forth.
I interviewed him once. He pronounces it Chalks.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Chalks.
Like there's the silent H.
Chalks.
Chalks. Okay.
So there's another thing that myth busted today. But yeah, like old Chalks. That's going to take me a while. I did one setup once. Didn't think that it was going to be an issue for that specific power supply, and mounted a pedal right on top, had noise issues, and then it took me a while. It's like, I lift the pedal up, the noise goes away. And so there are some troubleshooting things, some simple things you can do to just see where that noise issue is coming from. Because if you're listening, you do not have to put up with a noisy rig. There are fixes. And so that's, it's a good thing that we're chatting about this today.
Yeah. Friends don't let friends
play noisy.
Have noisy pedalboards.
Well, I even had one guy, he's like, man, I'm getting all this noise. I don't get where it's coming from. And the first question I asked him was, are you stacking anything on your power supply? He goes, yeah, putting my compressor on it. I was like, okay, well, take it off. And as soon as he took it off, it made that massive of a difference. That he was like, oh, shoot. He's like, I put my tuner on there, it doesn't do anything. I'm like, well, yeah, a tuner isn't the same thing as your compressor, and he was running it incredibly hot too. So yeah, that I agree. Friends don't let friends have noisy rigs. I completely agree. That those are sometimes it's really funny. Is like when we have shows here, like these guys are running 2 rocks and 412 cabinets on, and it's noisy and it's loud and stuff. But like for that style of music, like they don't care. But like when you're running like in-ear monitors, like this past weekend, we had a buzz in someone else's channel, and like he's like, "Oh, it's killing me! It's killing like just my overall focus." I'm like, it's so dumb, but it's true. That bit of a buzz like just throws me off, and I also just don't like noise. So yeah, I agree with you guys on that.
The other thing I have to say as well is, 5 years ago, 8 to 10 years ago, like this, as soon as I heard switch mode, it would be a little bit of a 4-letter word for me, because I had experiences or read blogs or articles where the switch mode supply, earlier ones, were very poorly filtered. And so they would add a lot of noise. That with, customers potentially not being as educated on what they can and cannot share on one outlet, all combined to create what would be a very frustratingly noisy rig. Now switch mode supplies are very well filtered, or tend to be the ones that we'll probably talk about today. And so the noise is not an issue if they're being used correctly. If they're being used, the correct pedals are isolated. There are definitely pedals you can daisy chain and share, but now the stuff is the specs on the power supplies. If you would have told me 10 years ago you're going to have a power supply with 1,000 milliamps on an output, I'm like, no, not a chance. Like that can't happen. But here we are. There's so much available and so much flexibility to suit the rig to what you're able to run now. So it's pretty impressive what is now available. The weight that they're available at as well, which if you're counting pounds or kilograms for all you metric people, love you. If you're counting the weight, then
Shout
going
out metric
from
system.
Thank you, the rest of the world. It's going from something like 1 kilo or 2.2 pounds down to 400 grams. That's a couple pedals sometimes. Like that's huge. And so going to switch mode as well, reducing weight can be a game changer for what you're able to pull off on a rig.
Yeah. Yeah, and Grant, if you can, talk to, the people up there in Canada, if we could get a metric system sponsorship, I appreciate that.
I will. I have to say though, Canadians love the imperial system more than they would like to admit. They're more imperial than metric most of the time. That's another podcast, but
Well, Canadians have to be ambidextrous, so to speak. With the metric
as America's top hat, we have to be flexible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're saying about the weight is certainly true. I mean, getting rid of the transformer and the weight that produces is certainly something to be considerate of. I think also the power differences. I mean, if we're setting aside noise and just putting it in its own little category, that's separate from what I'm going to talk about here is that the power alone is a lot greater. And that's the thing that I think is really the outside of the noise that can be mitigated, right? I mean, if you have a power supply that does have some magnetic field, you can put it in a far corner of the pedal board and not put anything around it, and you can somewhat mitigate the issue. The big benefits, however, separately from that of using a switch mode power supply is, one, it doesn't matter where you put it, but the amount of power available in a smaller, lighter package is greater, right? You can have 9 outputs with 500 milliamps for every single output and switchable voltages on several of those outputs, if not all of those outputs, like if it's a Chalks, that you can get that in a smaller package than a Pedal Power 2 that has as many outputs as a Mondo with almost double the amount of current available as a Mondo. Like, it's a no-brainer that you would go switch mode. And I agree with you that people had given switch mode a bad reputation. That is true. However, I think a lot of the reason that people associated switch mode with noise, especially with guitar pedals, is that there was a lot of companies that were providing cheap switch mode wall warts with their power supplies with pedals that were not designed for audio. Because switch mode power supplies can exist for all sorts of stuff. There's switch mode power supplies that are being used right now with my LED lights. Those are not designed for audio. So they can put as much noise on that as they want because there's not going to be any consequence to it. They aren't using it for the purposes of an audio signal. And if somebody who is and I can say this from a pedal manufacturer side, some of the bigger companies, they have parts buyers and they're basically just looking, they're searching Mauser and DigiKey or Alibaba or wherever they're buying their parts from to look for, a power supply that meets the specifications of the voltage and current needs. They may not be looking for any sort of noise rating or anything like that, or looking if it's a power supply that's designed specifically for audio applications or not. Because as I said earlier, switch mode power supplies were used in pro audio for a long time, and that's a very high standard comparatively to guitar pedals. And so certainly there was workable audio power supplies that were switch mode, but I think a lot of people got soured on it. And so I think, I've made some videos about this, and there's some people that are like, oh, linear power supply is quieter, and it's true if it's done properly and if it's in a very specific environment. But for the context of guitar players and the amount of filtering that is required for the thing, like, there's some frequencies that we don't even need to deal with, a lot of them, in fact, for guitar players. And so, if you kind of isolate everything and you're choosing a frequency that's outside of the audio range when you're doing your switch mode power supply design, there's no consequence to that. And we're never going to hear it. And it's going to sound quiet for us. And obviously instrumentation is going to be able to see certain things on a switch mode power supply that we can't hear. But that's not one of the design parameters. If our speed limit is 65 miles an hour, we're never going to be able to realize anything that in terms of, whatever the frequency is that's chosen for the switch mode supply as far as the high frequency switching.
Same goes if it's 100 kilometers an hour as well, actually, if you were to do the equation.
Yeah, we're doing the conversion.
Just for the conversion, just for the other guys listening.
Yeah.
No, and that's great. That's actually that's helpful for me to hear as well, because I just, like I said, for so long, switch mode was such a bad, a four-letter word for me. And so it's actually cool to hear some of the areas I was uneducated on, which when it comes to the specifics of power supplies, there are many. But yeah, I think even, this is a little bit of an aside, but even one of the things, just backtracking a little bit, that I do get a question a lot about, this is basic, but very important. When it comes to all these power supplies, now you see power supplies with 500 milliamps, 660 milliamps per outlet, and all these different voltage options available. It's really good to know. And if you guys already know this listening, that's awesome. But you can power a pedal that requires 20 milliamps, 5 milliamps off of 1,000 milliamp outlet. Like that's completely fine. There's going to be a lot of unused power there, but it's completely okay to do. You cannot power a pedal that specifically requires 9 volts off of an 18 volt outlet, irregardless of milliamps. So I know that's like a basic thing, but basically get the voltage correct and then overshoot your milliamps. Make sure there's more milliamps than required for the pedal, and then you can use just about any outlet if you kind of follow those two basic rules. I don't know, Mason, you're kind of driving this. I don't know if you wanted to chat about like current doublers, voltage doublers, at some point in this podcast, but that's also another common question, at least I get on my end as well.
Yeah, let's talk about some voltage doubling. So there's two distinct things, and I actually think it's a good thing that you brought this up, because this is a question that comes up in the comment section of some of our videos that are related to power supplies, where there is actually a confusion between voltage doubling versus current doubling, and that the same cable can achieve the same or can achieve different results. So
one will blow up your pedal, the other will not.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. Cut the red wire. So there's a lot of companies that make these sort of adapter cables. We also have videos about how to make your own with your existing power supply cables if people are interested in that. But in essence, a current doubler is basically just like a daisy chain cable, where you're basically just combining two outputs together in parallel so that you can get the greater number of current between the two. So let's say you have two 500 milliamp outputs on a power supply, and you have a line 6 HX stomp that needs 1,000 milliamps. You're going to make a current doubler or parallel two outputs so that you can still maintain the same voltage of them, 9 volts, but you're going to combine the current, two 500 milliamp outputs, to get 1 amp or 1,000 milliamps. And now you can power your HX stomp, presuming that you have the other side that's a 2.5 millimeter barrel. And I forget, is the HX stomp inverted polarity?
No, center negative.
Okay. Yeah. So then you're able to now power your HX stomp. This is different than a voltage doubler, where you're putting two outputs in series, so like 9 plus 9 to get 18 volts to power your 18 volt whatever it is, or your 24 volt Electro-Harmonix Qtron. You're taking two 12 volt outputs, combining them together, and this is wired a little bit different. And if you're doing it yourself, But you just need to make sure that you're buying the right cable, because I've had some situations where people buy like a Voodoo Lab cable and they see that it looks like a Y cable, and so the presumption is that it is usable in both applications, and they're very different cables. One of them is putting two power outputs in series. The other one is putting them in parallel, and the result is fundamentally different.
And it's important to note as well, for the current doubler, your voltage will stay the same, which you mentioned. And then for the voltage doubler, let's say you use two 9-volt 500 milliamp outlets, your current will stay the same. So you'll still have 500 milliamps at 18 volts. Or for current, you'll have 9 volts consistently, but 1,000 milliamps. So it's important to pay attention to milliamp outputs with these cables as well.
Yeah. So just be aware, current is different than voltage.
Very much.
A voltage doubler is not a current doubler. So just be careful. If you're wondering what that is, again, you can check out our video on it, and it shows you how to do it with the cables that are provided with your very power supply.
I do want to comment on, I've had a couple of times where power supplies, they don't have enough outputs to do the doubler cable. Yep. So we actually supply these exotic voltage doubler. It can do 15 or 18 volt.
I have my version as well.
Yeah. See?
This isn't a Goodwood product. I'm not saying my version is something we make, but I brought this out specifically to show like this. It's similar to that, where you can do 9 to 24 volts. The input can be 9 to 30 volts, and the output can be up to 1,500 milliamps. Like, there are extension things that you can buy, and man, there's a lot available on the market right now.
It's insane too, because I just did a board that had a memory man. It was the delay, not memory man. It was the diamond pedals.
Oh, the memory lane.
Yeah, memory lane. 24 volts. It's amazing. It was like, even the guy was telling about, I was like, dude, I couldn't stop playing it. But it was 24 volts, and I think it was 24 volt reverse polarity. And it was like my first time having to do that, but luckily the Zuma had two 12-volt spots to tie together. But yeah, I will say the same thing, like, especially with voltage, even milliamps, like some pedals, they have like Voodoo Labs. You can't power an LCAP from like port 1 on a Voodoo Lab, at least to my knowledge, because it still has to be 5 or 6, because those need correct milliamps, correct voltages, where like overdrives can do, the 100 milliamp spots. But yeah, that diamond pedal was very particular about its 24 volts, which was crazy.
Just a quick aside, guys. Do you think that the reason why Strymon changed the power supply to Zuma is that they got sued by Zumba?
It has crossed my mind in the middle of a Zumba class. I was like, man, it's close. It's close. Maybe my customers have been asking me about Zumba, and I've been assuming Zuma, and there's lost sales there. There's lost sales. I could see the lawsuit now. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, the result, my pedals are powered, they're quiet, and I'm feeling great.
Yeah.
Best shape of my life.
Yeah. No, I'm just teasing. It's a beach in LA. All their stuff is kind of named after stuff. Like Zelza is a street in the San Fernando Valley.
So Zuma is a beach?
Yeah.
I thought Zumba was my exercise classes that I don't actually attend.
Oh, Zumba, it may be that, but Zuma.
Oh, okay.
Zumba.
Yeah. My bad.
Yeah.
My bad.
Yeah. It's okay.
They come out with something called the Peloton or something, then they have issues. So.
Right. Well, that's gonna be the more eco-friendly, where somebody can pedal, to power the power supply.
Yeah, there you
go.
Work for your power.
They're stepping. My gosh.
One thing that we didn't talk about as well, as far as power supplies, is batteries, and where those may be beneficial or even preferable from a sonic standpoint as opposed to a switch mode and or linear supply.
You've done your battery pack, Mason, and so I would love to hear from my perspective, like where that came about, what got you onto that track to where you thought it would be smart, viable, and useful for your customers as a product. Like, I think in my mind, batteries are closely related to this. If you ever see on a power supply the sag feature, where you can drop voltage below 9 volts for a pedal that still technically requires 9 volts, and that's where kind of there's a little bit of a crossover, but there's still some obvious benefits with a battery. And I've always wanted to get your perspective on that as well, and where the battery pack comes into play.
Yeah. So we did make or I guess technically we still do, make a battery power supply where it has physical batteries inside of it. Let's see. I'll just bring it up so we can actually see it. And there are other companies that do this as well, so it's not just us. But we'll go over to our friends at Sweetwater since they have a nice photo. So this is the battery power supply, and you can see if you were to open the top of it, you have 4 batteries that can fit inside, and they each have their own outputs, and there's actually a 5th output, or input, I guess, that can be fed from an external power supply. So you can either use an external power supply to tell the batteries when to turn on and off based on whether the pedal board is powered on. And you can actually use it independently of any sort of power supply, and there's just a switch that determines whether it's using the input feed to determine whether the batteries are being on and off, or whether they're just on perpetually until the current is used up. And this can also just be used as an on-off switch if you're using the battery power supply on its own and you're not connecting it to anything, and you just want to have an on-off switch so that you're not using your batteries unnecessarily. And the way that this came up was actually probably almost 10 years ago. I was making a rig for a session musician named Michael Landau, and he had, I'll bring up this picture here. He had this old rack that he had made by Robert Bradshaw, and Robert Bradshaw had made him this this kind of primitive version, basically, of what I did. And so I'll bring this up on the screen too, so you can see what I'm talking about. Of course, if you want to see what I'm saying, you can visit us over on YouTube. So he had made him this kind of primitive version. Excuse me. He made this primitive version of what I did, where you can see that there's like batteries that are sitting on top of a Hammond 1590 BB enclosure. And then these batteries are powering specific pedals on his rack. And Michael had basically said, I want something like this that's more compatible with a power supply, or it's more compatible and looks more like a power supply, and is something that I can use for certain pedals in tandem with a standalone, kind of Voodoo Lab or whatever it was at the time. And so it was sort of taking this concept and making it something that was kind of resembled more of what an ordinary power supply would look like, instead of having the batteries outside. And I think that was more to just facilitate easy changeovers and stuff like that. And the way that we went about it is putting a thumb screw on the top and then having the batteries all incorporated inside of the enclosure, and then being able to change them just by removing the thumb screw. And I will say that there has been people that have even improved upon what I did. There's a guy named Jesse Davey, and he has a battery supply that I think is even more creative than the solution that I came up with, that I'll also show you. Let's see.
Jesse, is that King Tone?
That's King Tone, yeah.
Yeah, the red one, the little red one. Right?
Yeah.
That one's awesome.
Yeah, so he kind of did some, there's nothing proprietary about what I did. We're just taking batteries, So there's nothing, there's no secret, here in terms of what I'm doing. I think that anybody could really do this. The only thing that I added to the mix, was that here it is. And you can basically see that the batteries kind of fit right in the top here, and kind of go face down into it. And I could see where maybe this would be less advantageous if you were, say, going to mount it underneath a power supply or something like that. Mount it underneath the pedal board or something like that if the batteries are exposed. But for most people, this would be fine. I think the only thing that it doesn't do is it can't be used on its own, or you have to utilize one of the batteries and feed it into itself in order to use it, so you're drawing against the total amount of current.
Right.
But in terms of the way that he's put together this idea, it's very smart. And I would admit is for most applications is smaller than mine, and for most people would make more sense.
It's
Clever
also
design.
cool. Yeah. So what's cool about those two is that when the battery is low, like when it's dying, the LED turns from white to red. So it lets you know like your battery's dying. And I actually have we put one on Andy Timmons' board and one on Josh Smith's boards. And they like it because if they're getting close to dying or during a practice, like, oh shoot, like they'll swap it out real quick. But yeah, if you remove that battery, the pedal doesn't receive power anymore. So like that's the one part of it.
The good thing as well is you can get those battery clips. You can modify a cable and you can hook that battery power supply up to your isolated power supply, and then you don't need batteries anymore.
Yeah.
Totally kidding, guys. You guys looked. Oh, this guy's an idiot. Which actually brings up another point that we haven't actually covered yet: is why go to all this trouble of using batteries in the first place? Like, why not use an isolated power supply? What are the benefits?
Well, I mean, I don't use batteries. I mean, I have pedals that can use batteries. I don't hear the difference. But it's amazing to see someone, more seasoned musician like Andy. He lives locally, so he comes to the shop all the time. Or when Josh comes through, and like Josh got his board and he plays it, and he goes, "Did this go on a battery?" And I'm like, "Oh no, we did this." He goes, "Oh, I could hear the difference," and I don't know how he heard the difference because I've done them side by side, and he's like, "It's just the response." It's how that overdrive responds to me driving it that it just reacts differently. And to this day, and maybe it's just because I just got too much on my mind to really sit down and focus and hear the difference. But to someone that's their full-time job, like that makes a massive difference. Where Andy goes through hundreds of batteries, a year because it's the tone he wants, it's the way he wants it. If it's not broke, don't fix it. It's the kind of thing like he knows how he wants it to sound. So I have a lot of people, like one guy right now, I have a battery box to put his on. He's like, this fuzz just responds better on a battery. I'm like, well, we could, use the sag port on the Voodoo. He goes, I know, I've tried it. It just doesn't do the same. So to sum it up, my, understanding and thought is it's just the response is completely different.
Yeah, I would say that there is some things that batteries do that are different than a power supply. And, Grant mentioned a little earlier that a lot of power supplies like the Voodoo Lab and others have a sag control. And that's just adjusting voltage. And it's adjusting the voltage at a static number. So you can move it, let's say most outputs on a power supply are 9.6 volts. You can bring that down, assuming that the pedal, let's say, is operable down to 4 volts, you could bring it anywhere from 9.6 all the way down to 4 volts by using that sag control. And the pedal will still operate, and it will stay at whatever that static voltage is perpetually. That's one aspect of what batteries do. However, it's not a constant. Voltage in batteries, in particular carbon batteries, not your Duracell or Energizer, those pretty much... An alkaline battery, for the most part, resembles DC power supplies almost identically for almost all of its life until the very end when it sharply declines. So in terms of the benefit of a battery, if you're using a higher quality, again, Duracell, Energizer, those sorts of things, those are not going to produce the sonic sort of artifacts that people are talking about as the benefit of batteries. The ones that have the benefits are the real high impedance sources, like a carbon battery, the cheap dollar store, Ryovac, Everready, those sort of cheap batteries that nobody would electively use unless they were, again, at the dollar store and in a pinch. These types of power supplies are dissimilar from a linear power supply or a switch mode power supply in that not only are they fluctuating in voltage, they also are doing what's called current limiting. And so this creates sort of this interaction with the guitar and the pedal when the pedal is powered with that. Now, not every pedal is going to have this interaction. It's pretty much restricted to like vintage style, and I don't mean that it means that it's an old pedal. It just means that it's modeled after a vintage style effect, like an old school overdrive, a fuzz, a wah, distortion devices. Those are typically the types of effects that are going to be most sensitive to this sort of power source. And a lot of the new pedals don't have this sensitivity, even if they are overdrives and distortion pedals, because most manufacturers put protections and power supply caps on the pedal so that it's not sensitive to variations in the power source. It tries to kind of help maintain as consistent of a behavior as possible with a range of different ways of it being powered. And an easy way to tell, it's not the kind of a panacea where it's perfect every time, but a good sort of baseline is if you power a pedal on with a power supply and you unplug it, if you're using an ordinary power supply, you plug it in to your power source and you unplug it, you'll notice on some power supplies the LED will stay illuminated for quite a long time before it eventually kind of fizzles out, even though the power has been pulled from it. This would be an indication that it has a big power supply cap, which is helping to maintain the voltage in it, even if there is some fluctuation in the supply. These sorts of pedals will not be sensitive to the current limiting and some of the voltage fluctuations in a carbon battery, because those things are sort of dependent on the fact that there isn't any protection and it's somewhat at the whims of whatever the power source is doing. So I usually would tell somebody, if you're wondering if you have a pedal that might be sensitive to it, if there's either a really small power supply cap, which the LED goes out immediately as soon as you pull it, it might be a good way to sort of indicate that it's probably going to be a good candidate for this. But ordinarily, I usually think of it as overdrives, distortion pedals, stuff that is styled after a vintage type of effect, not really anything new. Like a Jackson audio pedal, for example, would be a bad pedal for this. Those are great overdrives, but he has to have a certain amount of current to perform all the things that he's doing. Having a voltage sag on a Golden Boy is not going to produce the best result.
Yep.
Especially with all of the relays and the things like that he's got going on inside of that type of pedal. Even though it's based on a vintage Marshall Blues Breaker, this is not going to be a good candidate for it. Whereas something like a Rat or an old Tube Screamer or a Fuzz Face or a Vox hand-wired wah, even though it's new, it's based on that old school style wah. Those are going to be things that are going to be more advantageous to be able to do a carbon battery. And again, carbon battery is more than just sag, because some people I know when they see videos of our power supply that has the batteries or the Kingtone, they're like, well, I can just do sag on my pedal power too, and it's not the same thing, because that's only one half of the total thing that a battery does. It does voltage drops, it's not 6 volts, 6 volts, 6 volts in perpetuity. It's, if you were to put a meter on it, if you dig into it, the voltage will drop and then regenerate. So it's like 6 volts for 500 milliseconds or 300 milliseconds, and then it regenerates back to whatever its last static voltage was. Equally, the current, will restrict. So you'll see like this interplay between voltage and current that's happening in real time. Having a sag control is just giving you a static voltage all the time. So it's really not addressing the full spectrum of what a battery does.
I do got to ask, maybe you already said it, Dan Electro batteries, is that like a special, like I have this guy up who has who has them in his?
Yeah,
in this
they're just
battery
carbon.
box?
They're just carbon.
Okay.
It's just a standard carbon battery.
Okay.
It's
I hear
it's
a lot
nothing.
about them. Yeah.
I mean,
I wasn't sure if that's like the secret one. Everyone's always talking about these Danner Electro. I'm like, I don't
they
know.
have different. I mean, every battery is different. You know, there's some guys that Eric Johnson will use specific batteries, and I know that there's even some guys. I think Josh would use certain batteries. In certain positions, in certain pedals, and not necessarily the same battery, you know.
Yeah,
and shout out to the battery resource that everybody should be getting their batteries from, Batteries and Butter, where you can not only get grass fed Irish butter, but also all of your carbon batteries all in one place.
It's a common pairing.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yep.
Yeah, like lamb and tuna fish, right?
Exactly. Surf and turf.
So, do they have like a subscription? You get like a pack of batteries and like a brick of butter, like a month.
The batteries come inside the butter, so you have to use the butter first, and then
that's a great idea.
Protects stuff, you know.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great idea.
If they don't have it, you should definitely pitch it.
Batteries and butter.
Yeah. Yeah, they have a great jingle.
How's it go again, Mason? La da da da.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I were a more talented jingle singer, but
on the spot jingle singer.
Right. Well, I mean, that's why the jingle people get the big bucks. No, they had Sheryl Crow do it, so it's great. She used to be a jingle singer before, you know, she made it big. Yeah, so I think that's kind of it on batteries. One other thing that we didn't talk about that we kind of mentioned in the introduction is talking about the RCA plugs on the chalk supplies, and maybe some of the people are confused by that often. Maybe we can get into it a little bit. Maybe disarm some of the people that are against the idea of an RCA connector. I'll just be the first to say the RCA connector is a better connection than the standard 2.1 millimeter barrel connectors.
Yes.
However, I think Chalks uses them primarily because they're so low profile. You know, like his power supplies are like an inch high. You know, and so I think part of it is that he can really create this low profile by using that style connector, but it is also a superior connector, just not standard for our industry.
Yeah, he actually has a. Go ahead, you go. No, are you sure? Okay, sorry. So we actually just watched a video up front, literally last week. We were talking about RCA connectors, and I literally was like, they're big, they're bulky, like just a connector, because they're pre-made. Like, I have all these DC connectors and whatnot. And I mentioned about being big and bulky, and Brian up front was like, but like, listen to the owner of Chalks. Is it Chalks? Is that what the term is? Chalks? Yeah. It was like, let him, like, he has a whole video why he uses it. He opens up he shows you the inside and like the connection, like how solid, like it made me realize, like, oh my gosh, like if I've been using the wrong connectors, like have I not been utilizing these more often? Because he said, here's a power supply with DC connections, and here is one with the RCA connections. This one was from a tour that it only lasted the guy a couple weeks. This one has lasted the guy on tour for this many years because the inside enclosure, the DC jacks weren't like falling down, the connections weren't coming loose. So like there's a lot of like benefits to him talking about. He's like, obviously, they can be a little bit bulkier, but like, they don't pull out as easy. Like they don't like fall out or get knocked out. But yeah, no, it's making me realize like how much more beneficial the RCA connectors have been. And like I've always kind of made fun of seeing the RCA, like, oh, why did you put RCA? But like they're just like a solid connection. They're very durable. I've never really realized it.
The thing that I also love about them, I again kind of stuck in my ways. Love the 2.1 just because it's familiar and easily accessible.
And it's metric.
Thank you. And but for the RCA ones, we'll use, because we make all our own cables for the setup, so we'll use the little Switchcraft ones, and they're pretty small. Like they do a great job, and again, very reliable. But the main thing, if I was to say in my mind, that I love about the RCA is they flip the ground to be on the shell or on the sleeve, the outside of the plug, so you can't accidentally short it out to the body of a pedal like you can with like the 2.1. So if something touches the outside of a metal RCA plug, it's not going to be a positive voltage. It's just going to be 0 volts. And so for me, it just puts my mind at ease. Not that I'm going around blowing up pedals because I'm using 2.1 mil connectors, but it's just one more layer of, okay, this is one less thing that can go wrong, one less thing I have to worry about. So the center of, or the tip of the RCA plug for a Chiox, thank you, is 9 volts or a positive voltage, and then the outside is the sleeve, just like a guitar plug would be. So that also puts my mind at ease.
The only challenge I've seen with this, I agree. I like the plugs a lot, and I use those supplies. I don't have any objections at all using them. One guy I did see that had been on one of our live streams was having some challenges because he bought the right angle switchcrafts.
Doesn't work.
Tight. Yeah.
Well, and it worked, but they have to touch each other, and because the center is on the center conductor is on the what would be the shield, and the ground is what would be on the tip, and if the metal housing of the switchcraft right angles are touching each other, you have all of the centers touching each other across all of them because they're not plastic like the ones that are provided.
Yep.
And so he was having some challenges there because he was basically creating a big parallel daisy chain of all of his right angle connectors. So if I like Grant's approach where you use the mini RCAs that are straight, that are impossible to touch each other. If you do end up using right angles for some reason, you just need to make sure that you put some heat shrink either on every other one, just so they're not making any contact, because it would be the same as wiring all those tips together. So just something to be aware of if you decide to go right angle.
It's a nice easy fix for them. Just get some electrical tape or heat shrink or something, you're fixed. But until you find that fix, that would be a hair pulling experience. That would be so frustrating. Yeah.
So we figured that one out, but yeah, they're really well made. I think it's one of my favorite supplies. The switch mode. He still makes a linear power supply, but he uses steel chassis for those, so he gets all the protections. And I would say he's one of the most. This is Paul Chalks, the designer. Is probably one of the most advanced power supply engineers that I've come into contact with. And that's not saying anything negative about other people that are making supplies, but he has spent his whole life just on power supplies. That's all he does. Doesn't make pedals, doesn't make anything else. He's just dedicated his life. If somebody's going to get a face tattoo of a power supply, it's going to be Paul Chalks.
Is that his last name?
Yeah, it's his last name.
Okay.
I think it's just Chalk. I think the S Chalk is like,
There's not more than one Paul.
Yeah.
Chalk. Yeah. I like that.
To make it possessive.
Yes.
Paul Chalks.
It does. I can't remember on it. Does it have like a through so you can add another Chalks to the Can you tie them together? Yeah,
so the Chalks 7 is kind of the one that has the mains connected to it. So the AC comes into that, and then you can expand it to an 8 or a 4.
Okay.
From there.
Yeah, I've seen the 4. Yeah, I've seen the 4 recently. Yeah, I saw what we talked about. How it chocolate. I can't remember that. The big one, the brown one.
The big brown one.
Yeah, that one is linear. That one's linear. And I think that they're moving. It's from when I had spoken to him. This was about a year ago. I think they're moving all toward switch mode ultimately. The other cool thing about the Chalks is that every single output is variable from 9, 12, 15, and 18 volts.
Yeah.
So you literally, from a assembly standpoint, don't have to make any differentiation for location when you're doing routing, which is really cool because sometimes, as both of you guys know, I usually will mark, with like blue painter's tape or something like that if I have specific things that I need to be aware of where they go. So as I'm routing, I'm being careful of, that these end up at the 18 volt outputs or these end up at the 12 volt outputs.
Yep.
With the chalks, you don't have to care at all. You're
That's
just like,
cool.
okay.
Plug it in.
Yeah. Plug it in, set the dip switches accordingly. And the other cool thing about the chalks that none of the other power supplies that I'm aware of do is they tell you with an LED indicator that's like graduated, how much of the current max you've used. So you know if you're at 60% of max or 80% of max on the current, so that you can ensure that you're not using too much of or overloading the power supply.
Yeah, I also like the fact that the dip switches are on the top.
Yeah.
You'll get like the Voodoo Lab stuff where it's on the bottom side, some of them, or even the Zumas where the 9, 12, 18. Like I've had guys like, oh yeah, I'll just reach my hand in. I'm like, please, like look what you're going. Either you're going, if you're at 12 volts, you're going down to 9, or you're going up to 18, and that can destroy a pedal. Like that can like. You have a clone or something on there.
How to void your warranty in one easy dip switch. Yeah.
It happens I had one guy, he got we get KTRs very, very scarcely here. And when we do, like we sell them out within like 2 minutes. And we had one guy who got one. It was local, got it home, was so excited, plugged it in, flicked the switch, 18 volt.
Is it supposed to smoke?
He goes, it's not working. And we're like, we just got it. And like open it up. I went, yeah. You just open it up and smell it.
You're supposed to waft, Brian. Waft instead of direct sniff.
A wine taster. But yeah, I was like, yeah, this is. Did
you do the wafting technique?
I did that.
Yeah, that's it. I smell 18. I smell 18 right there. Yep.
I opened up a good one. I was like, yep, that's 9 volts. Oh, that's 18. Yeah. No, unfortunately that happened, but yeah, that makes a massive. I've done a couple of that to myself when I started out on my own stuff, and that makes a big difference.
That's an easy fix though on a clone. I think it just has a Zener diode that needs to be replaced.
Well, with the KTRs, we have to be it's not like an easy swap, like because everyone's so particular about what's in those. Like I think JHS had a clone for a while. They're like, oh yeah, just get this and swap it out. And I was able to do it myself, but I know Bill probably uses very special. I don't know. I don't know.
Well, most of the pedals that have this, they'll have a Zener diode or some sort of protection to basically act as a fuse, basically like a fuse on an amp. So the fuse blows and it protects the rest of the circuit. And I don't remember on the Klon if it has that or not, but if that's the case, I mean it's not an audio component. It's like it's just a protection to not kill the rest of the circuit if it's
makes sense.
Yeah.
One easy tip if you're still if you're listening and don't want to do that. I always tell people make your power supply adjustments with everything, with the mains power unplugged from the board. So do all your adjustments, double check them, and then you can plug it in after that. But never do it when your board is powered up, please.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and there's of course, you can use your multimeter to determine it, or if you really don't know in your concern, if there's an old, I don't know, something that you don't care about, your old Boss tuner, your TU2 from 15 years ago, you can use that as the sacrificial power receptor. Make sure that everything's working at the 9 volts or whatever it is, and go from there. Well, I feel like we covered a lot. We talked about switch mode. We talked about linear supplies. We talked about the benefits of each. We talked about RCA. We talked about batteries. I think where we should end is we give our Mount Rushmore of power supplies for each of us. Let's say, the top 3 or 4 power supplies that we like and prefer, and we can end it there.
Great. I think for me, I still really enjoy the ease of the Strymon series. So Zuma, this is another pronunciation thing. Ojai, Ojai. I say Ojai. Um, like that series is great. They do use the 2.1 mil barrel connector. So again, we talked about RCA versus barrel, but they're just super easy, light, easy to get as well. The Chuck stuff is awesome. Love the dip switches on the each individual outlet. And if you need it, they do have an additional like a little bit more current per outlet than the Strymon series does. So I think is it 660 instead of 500?
660. Yeah, at 9 volts it's 660.
Yeah,
It'll go down as you use more voltage.
As you increase the voltage. One other one I did want to bring up though, in case anyone hasn't heard of these guys yet, is it's a company somewhere I think in Europe. Is Yankee. Have you guys ever come across Yankee power supplies?
Is it like related to Daddy Yankee?
Well, I think they're over in Europe and they want to sound a bit more American. So, but they do like the specs on the outlets of these things, and they have a digital LCD readout, so you know exactly where the voltage is at for each outlet.
Oh yeah.
But they're big, like they're big supplies. But if you need like high current AC, high current DC, they have a ton of options as well. The one thing I will say, I believe it is linear. I think it's a steel chassis though. But the one thing I will say, and this is something that you will not care about until you need it, their customer service could be better. So that's the one thing I would say on them. The specs are awesome, but if you need a quick response or customer support, I would probably go somewhere else. But that would probably be the top 3 that I would be considering for different applications.
I'm gonna have to say I'm gonna go with the Strymon series as well. It ends up being we stock some. I'm literally looking at the shelf. We have shelves of them. They're easy and they're great and they're very compact. The extension systems with the Ojais. I'm not a huge fan of the cable that goes between the Zuma to the Ojai. Just that barrel plug. I think we've all already talked about. It's very hard to source. Like I don't think I've even found a right angle plug to work yet. I can't. I can find some straight ones, but not right ones. Anyway, so those are like the biggest series that we sell. We sell a lot of the Voodoo Lab. They're literally right above me. Of the pedal power 8s, but I would say the Zuma, the Ojai, and the Mondos have been the biggest ones for us and for me. Mason,
I think in no particular order, I agree. I think the Strymons are great. I think that mechanically they're maybe a little underbuilt. In that I find that the IEC is susceptible to coming loose. The side screws are susceptible to coming loose. The screws that connect the PC boards together have come loose in certain circumstances. So this is not at all an objection to the electrical design. This is simply the mechanical. I find that whenever I get them, I actually have just bought longer screws because the countersunk machine screws that go into the side, they could actually be quite a bit longer than they are and not touch anything or impede anything. And sometimes if those start to work themselves out, things start kind of sloshing around in there. So the first thing I do if I'm using one is I get a longer screw and I use some Loctite on that and resecure the stuff on the side. And then I will put a lock washer on the inside of the IEC, on the back side of it. And I think it has a washer on there as it is, but just getting something that kind of digs into the plastic, has some teeth on it. It just gives it a little bit more robustness so that we don't end up having the enclosure sort of undo itself. So I like Strymon a lot electrically. I just think it needs to have some of those things considered. I like Chalk's switch mode supplies a lot. The Chalk 7, Chalk 8, Chalk 4, those are really wonderful. I think they're very well built. I think that they're really smartly designed. I think the voltage in the current stuff is really great. I think that True Tone is also a really good budget choice. I think that they do a good job I think that for most people it'll be a fine supply. I think the CS12, CS6, CS7, those are good options, and again, really budget friendly. And I would also say that the Fender supplies are surprisingly good. They definitely were inspired by Strymon, unquestionably. We I think we mentioned this privately, the couple of us, where like the radius of the bends are the same as the Zuma, and the profile is very similar. But for the price, in getting 12 outputs, having variable voltage outputs, having a USB connector to, charge your iPad with your sheet music on it, if you have that on a mic stand or something like that, there was a lot of things that I think that they did well and improved upon, and they have several different sizes. They have courtesy outlets, which is unusual for most of the switch mode supplies. I think it's mostly on account of it connecting to some of their other power supplies that have AC mains. But I think that those are also actually fairly good supplies. They had sent me some, and I've been evaluating them, and I've been surprised at the quality of them relative to the price. They don't have any marketing material really out about them at all. I don't think there's a single video except an unboxing video about them on YouTube. So they're actually a pretty decent supply from what I can tell. I've put them, I've compared them to the other switch mode power supplies out there for noise, and going to be doing a video about them, just to maybe, not evangelize them, but maybe just say this is kind of realistically where they stack up against their fellow switch mode power supplies. And those are, I think, a good option for people. And, 12 outputs, that's pretty dang good. And it's got everything from 9 to 18 volts. That's pretty dang good. And it's, it's less than a Zuma.
Yep. Yeah, that's great. I actually haven't had one personally yet, so it's cool to hear the initial take on it. It's promising.
It's a weird name, the Engine Room.
Okay.
I don't know if I would have gone there.
I don't think there's an engine inside the supply as well, so it's a little misleading from my perspective.
Right. Yeah. You better talk to the Fender marketing. Yeah. So, guys, that was a cool conversation. I hope everybody enjoyed. Of course, if you like the podcast or you're watching this on YouTube, you should definitely throw us a comment if there's something that you object to, something that you want to know more about, and we can happily address that. If you're listening to it, we don't really have an easy way to go through comments, but I guess you could email any of us, or you could go over to YouTube and leave a comment there, which will mirror the exact same podcast that you listen to. It'll just have our faces there, and Brian with his subliminal Strymon plug. And you can ask us about the metric system, or
always up for talking metric, guys. Please, someone join me.
Yeah, and Grant's going to work on that. Getting a little endorsement here for the podcast.
Thank you.
So just let us know if you can work on that. And any final thoughts? Any well wishes to listeners or viewers?
I would just say if any of this is still confusing, I mean, kind of similar to last week, don't rush into just buying a piece of gear, which I know I've been tempted by. Just buy it, get it over with so I can keep things moving. But just, ask a question, wait for an answer. We'll get back to you. There's tons of info online. And ultimately, it'll lead to a quieter, more pleasant to use, fun to use rig.
Same. I'm gonna say the same thing exactly.
All right.
Love it. Copy and paste. It works.
All right.
Copy and paste.
All right. Thanks, guys.
See you guys.
Awesome. See ya.